Greetings. This is Griff Ruby, here to announce the revised edition of my original magnum opus, which is the resurrection of the Roman Catholic Church. But before I get into that, I'd like to get a little bit of an overview into the history of this work and of my life and my connection with traditional Catholicism. I first met up with the traditional Catholic in the form of an ex-nun from the CMRI who had been with them in the days of Schuckardt and left them in the days of Schuckardt and stayed on her own as a home aloner. By the time I knew her, she was getting hooked up with Ken Mach, the conclavist. But she was a very intelligent person. She knew a lot of theological things and Catholic things that I hadn't seen before. I'd wanted to be Catholic. I felt some sort of at the Novus Ordo that I had attended at the time, conservative but still Novus Ordo, there was kind of that morose atmosphere. I'd known intellectually that they used to have Mass in Latin, not anymore. I wasn't sure of the significance of that, though I had managed to find a one-shot Latin Mass in my parish when they had a special occasion that they decided to celebrate that way. I think it was a Latin Novus Ordo, but at the time I wouldn't have known the difference, so I'm not sure. They did everything in Latin and even the homily. But I thought, well, it's interesting, but I don't know how I would have been able to take it, but I was glad to have seen it. But I didn't really know more. It's more like when you come home and people have been arguing and now they're kind of not talking. It kind of felt like that, the whole atmosphere there. But I had read enough of just Christian history and church history and some of the basic theological beliefs of the church, about Mary and the Eucharist and so forth, to be able to see I should be a Catholic. And so that's what I wanted to do. So the obvious thing is you go to the building where it says Catholic and you go, okay, there you go. Okay, well, but I got this letter from this young nun, well, probably about my age, actually, back in 1991. And we corresponded a little bit. And like I said, I don't know that it was the greatest way to be introduced, but she still had friends up at the Mount St. Michael's in CMRI. There was, of course, the Mass there, and I hadn't seen for sure a real full-blown proper Catholic Mass. And at least she could admit that it was what the Mass should look like. So I went up in 1992 and visited and met up not only with her, but also with various people up at Mount St. Michael's, saw the Mass for the first time, and got to know a lot of what was going on. I also had a chance to head 30 miles down the road, where in Post Falls, Idaho, the SSPX had a major priory for the whole northeast part of America. So I'd gotten to see both of these places. Apparently there was also, though I'd only see this a year or two later on, the City of Mary that's kind of up to the north of those places in a place called Rathdrum. And I was getting to know and understand a lot about all this tradition, but I was also realizing there's a whole lot of history here that I knew nothing about. A lot of people. I didn't know who they were or where they came from, and even a lot of different argumentations and disputes and other questions and problems that had been raised and weren't very well understood. So I kind of remember wishing in that earliest time, if necessary, trying to figure it all out and write it myself if nobody else has done this first, and nobody had, to write a kind of who's who of Catholic traditionalism. Well, before long that kind of expanded to the idea of maybe writing a whole volume biography of each the major figures in this, and it could be quite a series. And at some point I kind of dawned on me that that's really out of scope to me as a writer, to readers. And so what I needed to do was what I should do is find some way to condense it all down, because there was so much, and there's just so much yet to learn and to understand. And I could see that there's a big difference between the Catholicism of history, which I could see this is what it was, as distinct from what was called Catholicism at the local Novus Ordo franchise outlet where I lived. Despite any sincerity on their attempt, they don't know. They have nothing to give. What they don't have, they can't give. So I'm kind of like, well, I want to know more about this. And I studied and I read. I found every book that anybody suggested that had anything to do with this, all the different viewpoints, every possible magazine, journal, publication, fact sheet, even parish bulletins, anything I could get my hands on, to say nothing of live interviews with a lot of the different people. Now, you do anything for hours and hours, say 6 hours a day for 7 years, you become an expert at it. And my knowledge of traditional Catholicism had become truly encyclopedic. I had even begun corresponding through a priest who had a email group that you could send stuff in, and if he thought it might be interesting, he'd share it with his group, and then people could feed back or say what they thought of it, they like it, they don't like it, and so forth. And so actually a lot of ideas as they were still forming in my mind were put out there, and they'd come back. Sometimes he'd think of things, or other people would think of things, or things would be refined or tuned or whatever. But this was not just me sitting in a vacuum coming up with stuff. But finally I realized that this whole series of volumes was hopelessly out of scope, and I realized that I needed to take this vast encyclopedic knowledge I had. And so in September of 1996, I finally sat down and started again, afresh and anew, what was meant to be just a single volume that would summarize all of this. It would explain the whats, the wherefores, the whys, and the whens, and the who, and all these things, and explain everything, basically. So I began writing it, and it wasn't long before I had figured out what title it would have, and that it would be called The Resurrection of the Roman Catholic Church. But there was still the book to write, and it takes time to write a book, and especially one that's heavily based on research. But by the middle of 1998, I finally had a full-length manuscript. Now, all of that book, of course, is my book, though there were 2 sections, a tiny epilogue and an appendix, that from the outset I've intended to be available, and they're donated to the public domain, because I want those to be able to go as far and wide as possible. They're included in the book. The rest of the book, though, is the book, but they're included in the book because they're as much mine as everything else, but they need to be able to go far into places the book itself might not go. So they are in the public domain. And later in 1998, or maybe early 1999, another friend of mine that I met through all of this in Australia by the name of Philip Madsen had actually put on those 2 portions of my book online, made them available for the first time. They were well received. The first appendix, you see, has a very simple, basic message, and it's called The Pope Condemns Vatican II, because there's so many aspects of the whole Vatican II religion that have been seen by various popes, Pius XII, the 11th, the 9, Benedict XV, Leo XIII, Gregory XVI, Julius III, and St. Pius V, and some of these other older popes from all down through history who had seen aspects of the Novus Ordo religion, and at every turn always and consistently condemned them. So although the Vatican II itself didn't exist, nor the religion it created, the popes had seen bits and pieces of this thing being coughed up by various sects and isms and dissenters and what have you down through the ages, and at every turn it was always systematically condemned. And so what was this passage, what was this chapter, but to give extracts of these popes talking about and condemning these various aspects? And that's the vast bulk of that. And that's an appendix that is so important because it goes beyond anything that's any mere opinion of mine. These are the Pope speaks, basically, is what it is. The Pope speaks. The Pope has condemned, in the person of all these popes, has condemned Vatican II, and that is what needed to be said to everybody. But other than that, it was still an unpublished manuscript. When I finally met up with a publisher, I was able to come up with the first edition that came out in 2002. And The first edition's a little bit rarer. It's kind of nice that it has a large print, but it was a very preliminary edition, and I knew that it would have to be updated. As a matter of fact, within a couple of years, some fairly important events had happened. Most notably, the movie, The Passion of the Christ, came out in 2004 and was a major boost to traditional Catholicism at the time. So I had to not only include that, but also I had to include a few other events that had happened. And I was thinking more in terms of, the Catholic religion is all around the world. I had already, because of my first edition, gained some further correspondence in many different parts of the world and learned yet more stuff going on in traditional Catholicism in other parts of the world. So it was time to revise it fairly quickly again, and I did. And this time when we went through with the revision, the publisher also offered to make a hardback edition. Okay. And that was my official edition of the book for a good long time. Well, a lot of years have passed. My hope had been to be able to connect up with some very well-trained priest or clergy or bishop or somebody that would be trained in the theological sciences. Because I'm very conscious of the fact I may be a well-read layman, but I'm only a layman, and there are things that you could miss when you don't have formal training. So what I wanted was to be able to pair up with somebody as kind of a mentor in these things. I could show them stuff, they could show me stuff. We could come to a better, deeper, more thorough, and far more precise understanding of things. Well, year after year went by, and all the various people who I potentially could have done this with kind of one by one died off before I had an opportunity to really go out and meet these people. Father Stepanich, for example, would have been a great example, but I really had hoped to do that. But by the time I'm really ready to talk to him, he's laying there. He's putting out a newsletter for a little while, which he sent me, and that was really nice. And then he stopped, and then he was gone. Yeah, and unfortunately, that was probably one of the last of the really, trained experts I could have turned to, because you can't trust those trained in the modernist seminaries because they've been learning modernist gobbledygook, and whatever bits of Catholicism they might have picked up, they're all intermixed and reinterpreted through the lens, of the false religion, and so I don't want to have to try to filter everything. I want it straight. Finally, what ended up having to happen was I had to do all that research myself. Various circumstances led up to that, which then led up to me doing my Sede Vacante books, which I introduced just a couple of years ago. So, Sede Vacante, of course, was a theological discussion. It explored a lot. It was a chance for me to learn all this stuff that trained people know. And basically my mentor therefore was all these people, was Van Noort, was Sylvester Berry, was St. Bellarmine, and various others, to other lesser, Journet and so forth, although I had to take some bits of him with a grain of salt, but at least he was honest that you could know when there's something he's saying that he says you can take this with a grain of salt because of, bear this other thing in mind that there's, I'm just putting you on notice. So he was at least honest in that way. And other writers, canonists, and just all the sources. So having discovered all of that, and having over the years come up with a number of things that also needed to be revised, some historical details that I hadn't known earlier that do kind of change and color some of the things. I had thought not enough of Archbishop Thuk and too much of Michael Davies, but on the whole, a lot of the history I have is sound, but there were lots of details, especially when it came to the more technical ecclesiological doctrines, canonical details, and so forth. And so I had to take all of those changes and go through and make a very detailed revisitation of everything into what is now my new edition, and you can distinguish it because it says 2019 updated and corrected edition. So it is a little bit longer. There has been more historical events, and all of this has to be represented in there. And as before, my publisher insisted on making sure that it would be available in both paperback or hardback edition. So that's the text there, and this is my new resurrection book. It has the opening chapters kind of introduce the situation, the whys and wherefores, my theory, my Lumen Gentium theory, more carefully and objectively discussed as a theory, with a great deal to recommend it. But it is a theory. Let somebody come up with something better if they can, but I'm not going to rule that out because you never know. And then, after discussing some of this background material, I begin chapter 6, as I did before, with what I call the beginnings of today's stand for the faith. And it just goes on through the bishops, let's see here, the advance of Marcel Lefebvre and the SSPX, the bishops of Pierre Martin Godin Thuc, the advance of the Sede Vacantists, the advance of the, there's another group here, the bishops of Marcel Lefebvre and Tony de Castro Mayer, the advance of the indult priests and the FSSP. That was once a very long chapter. I broke it into two, which now breaks as a new chapter called Catholic Lay Apostolates and Further Events, so that some of the more recent stuff to occur could happen. After which comes the conclusion and the epilogue. And after that would be the appendices. So the Appendix 1, that's in the public domain, still is, and the epilogue was in there. And then the original edition had an appendix of questions and answers. The newer edition had the questions and answers plus a third appendix of further questions and answers that had come in after my book was available. In this one, I've incorporated those two together into a single longer appendix, along with a few newer questions as well. And then finally at the end, a glossary and a bibliography. But there's also, between the epilogue and the first appendix, a new afterword. And in this I discuss in much detail what it was precisely I needed to, somewhat update, but mostly what needed to be corrected. So this now is no longer a, let's just say, beta version. This is now the definitive text. It is the history of the survival of the Roman Catholic Church into this Vatican II and post-Vatican II era. And there's nothing like it yet out there. There are some histories of particular societies, somewhat kind of short, abbreviated, but you could probably get all of that and a bit more from this, to say nothing of all the other groups that haven't really documented themselves very well, or in many cases explain themselves terribly well, but they do what needs to be done, what the church has always needed. And so this is the new book, and that's all I have to say.